If you have the vulnerabilities exposures and you don't have the data back up and they get into your network and they're able to encrypt all of your data, they're pretty deep into your network, right? This is not like a denial of service attack from the internet. They're in your systems. Welcome to Life of a CISO. I'm Dr. Eric Cole, your host, and we'll be taking you on a journey each week on what it takes to be a CISO and what are solutions that you can implement today if you are currently a Chief Information Security Officer or if you want to be one in the future. This is Life of a CISO. Welcome to this week's edition of Life of a CISO with yours truly, Dr. Eric Cole. And it's truly one of my favorite times of the week where we get to talk about cybersecurity and, more importantly, what it takes to be a Chief Information Security Officer. Now, the topic that keeps coming up again and again, so it's inevitable that I'll do an episode on ransomware, right? So let's just go ahead and jump right in. First, ransomware is where malicious software gets on a system and essentially makes your data unusable to those who need it. And unless you pay the ransom, you don't get your data and you don't get your information back. Now, what's interesting is it would seem that an easy, simple solution that most organizations would be using is a backup, right? If we have a backup of our data or a backup of our information, then if we get hit with ransomware, it would be the same as if a server crashed or a server went down, and we would just restore our information and get back up and running again. The problem started many years ago when we started having multiple data centers, cloud, and others, where we've confused replication with backup. So a lot of my clients and organizations that were brought in to help them deal with, negotiate, and recover from ransomware attacks often goes in, but Eric, we have triple or quadruple backups of our data. Why can't we recover it? And I say, no. You have triple or quadruple replication of your data, but it's not backups, and here's the difference. With replication, when my data is changed in one location, it will automatically replicate to 4 other spots. So we have clients that will have 2 data centers in the United States, East Coast, West Coast, or sometimes they do East Coast, Midwest because of the earthquakes in California, right on the West Coast. And then they'll do a Far East, and they'll do one in Europe. So probability of an event taking down all 4 of those is almost zero, right? It would be a earth-ending event, right, if that really did happen. So they feel pretty comfortable that if one of those servers crashed or went down, the data is replicated to other facilities so they can continue to operate. Here's the problem. Attackers are clever. Attackers have your playbook. Attackers know how you operate and function. So the replication that is meant to actually provide redundancy and protection is actually used against you, because what the attacker has to do is only get into one of your data centers. That they really only have to get into one of your servers. So let's say in your data center you have server clustering, and that server clustering replicates to 4 other data centers around the world. If I can get into one server and I can encrypt all your data, as far as the server believes, that's a data update. So what does it do? It replicates it to the cluster. And then what does that cluster do? It replicates it to all the other data centers. So essentially this magnificent, wonderful redundancy that you set up is basically used against you, because now an attacker can replicate their ransomware very quickly across all your data centers, and all your data's gone. So we need to step back and remember there's still a role for backups. Companies still need to go in and do physical backups, whether it's tapes. What we do with some of our clients is they actually back up to a system over the network, and then they disconnect that system from the network. So now even if one of the primaries gets infected with ransomware, it can't replicate to other systems, other sites or other locations. So it's very, very important as a CISO that you work with your IT teams and recognize, do we have backup or do we have replication? And actually do tabletop exercises on ransomware. If this system got impacted with ransomware, what would be the true impact? What would be the compromise? What would happen and how would we recover? And how would we get back up and operational? So to me, it's sort of multi-problems with ransomware. First, organizations are not fixing the vulnerability in which ransomware enters, and we'll cover that in a little bit in this show. The next part is they don't understand or recognize the impact that it will have. They don't have a recovery or incident response plan, and they don't have their data properly backed up. Now, I'm going to caveat all of those because it always cracks me up. When I say they don't have an incident response plan, they don't have an effective incident response plan. And when I say they don't have a backup, they don't have an effective one. So we had one of our clients who got hit with ransomware and they ended up having to pay the ransom. And I gave a briefing to the executives, and I kid you not, the technical folks, as I'm giving the briefing, they're going, Eric, that's not correct. You said we don't have an incident response plan, and we absolutely do. Just want to take a quick break. I hope you're enjoying the show. I have this free webinar that I would love for you to check out if you want to become a world-class CISO. And I said, how did that work out for you? And they sort of looked at me. I'm like, you weren't able to respond. You had to pay the ransom. So how well did that plan work out for you? And they're like, well, it didn't work. I'm like, okay, I was trying to be nice and say you didn't have an incident response plan. But if you want to be correct, I'll be correct. You had a crappy, ineffective incident response plan. And I'm thinking in my head, like, does that make you feel better? I'm like, well, I'm trying to help you out here. Why would you do that, right? And then it's the funniest thing in the world because you think they would have learned, right, that I'm trying to help them and minimize impact there. So then I get to the next side and I'm like, and you didn't have backups of your data. You only had replication. And they go, Eric, that's not true. We absolutely backed up our data. And I said, then why'd you pay the ransom? And they're like, well, the backups didn't work. I said, okay, so once again, we want to go here. And the CEO at this point, he's just like laughing, shaking his head like, really, this is what you're going to fight with the folks on? And it was just like, I'm trying to help you out here, right? So I always go in and say either you don't have it or it's not very good, right, at that point. So you want to make sure that you're really covering those core components. You want to do tabletops. If these servers got compromised, if those servers got compromised and it replicated, how would you respond? How would you get your data back? Where is the data located? How quickly could you get the information? Because once again, having tape backups that are stored 7 hours or 8 hours away might not be effective. You might want to have multiple plans where you do have some offsite, but you do have some local on-site copies so you can recover very, very quickly. The name of the game today is these attacker groups have basically commercialized cyber criminal activity. They're looking at companies, they're targeting companies, and they're going after companies. So the probability of your organization getting hit with ransomware, it's going to be pretty high. I mean, it's one of those, we got to stop this old approach that bad things don't happen to my company, that we're not going to get hit. I often go in and I start talking ransomware strategies for our clients, and they're like, oh, Eric, well, we're not big enough, or we're not small enough, or we're not whatever enough, right, that somebody's going to target us. And I sit there and go, wouldn't you rather spend a little money and be prepared than have to pay the ransom? And here's the thing that everyone misses. If you have the vulnerabilities, exposures, and you don't have the data back up, and they get into your network, and they're able to encrypt all of your data, they're pretty deep into your network, right? This is not like a denial of service attack from the internet. They're in your systems. So even if you pay the ransom in order to recover, what do you think is going to happen long term? You either have to redesign and rebuild your entire network, or essentially you have to have a line item on your financial statements of quarterly ransom payments. I mean, these clients and companies we've heard about in the news that have got hit with ransomware. And they're like, oh, we got through that, right? We had to pay the ransom, but we got through that. We're up and operational again. I'm like, really? You think this is done? Well, what do you think happens in a couple months when they want some more money, right? When they're going to go and demand more ransoms? Essentially, it's one of these where if you're not careful, you could actually have to pay these quarterly payments to protect your network from the bad guys. It's like the mafia in the 70s in New York City, right? The organized crime would go to these storekeepers and basically say, you need to pay us a couple $100 a week for protective services. They're like, nobody's bothering me. I don't need protection services. And they're like, no, protection from us, right? Because if you don't pay us, we're going to trash your store. We're going to break your windows. We're going to cause more damage than if you just paid us. So it's cheaper and easier to pay us. Illogical, illegal, unethical, but unfortunately, that's the game we are now, seeing the same exact thing we saw with physical crime in big cities like New York that we're now seeing on the internet. So that's really the bigger picture is, if you pay once, are you going to be paying for the rest of your lives? Which essentially brings up the next question. Should you pay the ransom? And I always love when this debate comes up, because it's really two debates. There's a theoretical debate and there's a practical real world debate. And you always get some of the theoreticals. Oh, you should never pay the ransom. You shouldn't support organized crime. You shouldn't do this. You shouldn't do that. It's bad, bad, bad. Evidently, you've never run a business, right? Because if you're running a business, it comes down to money and monetary. So with most of these companies, here's the problem. If you fail to protect your organization, if you fail to implement effective security measures, and somebody got into your entire network and was able to take control of all your critical data so you were not able to recover it, you really have two options. Option one is recover in 24 to 48 hours and pay the ransom. Or option two is you're down for 6 months and you have to spend 5 times as much as the ransom payment to get your systems up and running. If you give almost any executive those options, $5 million and you're up in 48 hours, or you're down for 6 months and pay $30 million, it's almost, unfortunately, a no-brainer to go in and have to pay that ransom. And what doesn't help us here is organizations like the city of Baltimore and a few others that didn't pay the ransom and said, no, we're going to be good. We're not going to support unethical activity. We're not going to pay the ransom, right? Like a Twisted Sister. We're not going to take it. Whoa! Right? I saw them in concert. They're awesome, by the way. So awesome group. Gotta love 80s rock, right? So it's sort of like a We're Not Going to Take It Twisted Sister video. And guess what happened? It took them almost a year and a half, and I think it was almost 10 times the amount of the actual ransom payment to recover. So everyone's sort of learning, yeah, that's not the way to go. The other thing I hear, which I think is a really bad idea, is let's make paying ransom illegal. All that's going to do is drive up the price. I will tell you right now, if you're a business and you have two choices. Now, remember, large companies have two choices. You pay $5 million and you're up in 48 hours, or you pay $30 million and you're up in 6 months. Smaller, medium companies have two choices, but they're different. I pay $100K in ransom and I'm up within 48 hours, or I go out of business. It's that simple, because these smaller companies can't afford to be out of data for 6 months. They can't afford to have no customers for 6 months. They can't afford to spend $2 or $3 million. They don't have it. So that's the part of the story that everyone's missing which is a lot of companies are being put out of business because of ransomware, or they have to pay the ransom. They don't have a lot of choices. To me, if we want to get real and we want to get laws and regulation, why don't we make regulation that says you can't have servers accessible from the internet missing patches? Why can't we say that critical data must never be directly accessible from the internet? Why don't we put regulations in place to hold people accountable for implementing effective security instead of coming up with a random paying ransoms are illegal, which really doesn't effectively solve anything except basically forces organizations to commit crime? Look at what happened with drugs. When drugs became illegal, that's when it grew, right? Because the price, the supply, the demand factor on those fronts. So we got to go in. If we're going to solve it, let's solve it correctly and not just put some arbitrary measures in place. But you as a chief information security officer need to recognize a few things. One, how vulnerable are your systems? And I'll go over that in a second. And if your systems are super vulnerable, your only option for the short term, if you get hit with ransomware, might be to pay the ransom. So the question is, do you have accessibility to Bitcoins? Because that's pretty much how most of these get paid. So we know a lot of clients now, and either through your insurance company or directly, they're actually setting up Bitcoin accounts. They're setting up Bitcoin brokers, and they're having accessibility to money. So this way, if they do need to pay a ransom, they can. I know it's a different way to look at things, but it is a conversation that chief information security officers need to have with their executives. And you need to present out a roadmap. I do this with our clients. I say, listen, right now your organization has about an 80% chance of getting hit with ransomware. And based on the size of your organization and other entities, it's going to be about a $3 million payment. Now, if we do what we normally do, and we re-architecture and protect and patch and update, it'll be about $300K, and you will be protected. That number will drop from 80% likelihood to 20, but it will take 6 months. So for a 6-month period, you're going to be vulnerable. Another option is we could spend $800K and get it fixed in 3 months, or we could spend $2 million and get it fixed in a month. What would you like us to do? What option would you like? That's how effective chief information security officers communicate. They're speaking in a language the execs understand. They're talking about likelihood, monetary damage, and cost to fix it. And they're also going in and giving them some different options. You could do nothing, and this is what will happen. You can do the low cost, the medium cost, or the high cost. And you're now giving them different options. The only thing that's critical of a chief information security officer is make sure you can deliver. Make sure if they give you $2 million, you can actually deliver and have a solution in place. And if you don't know, like I was dealing with a client, and that's where I added the third option. I used to go in with 3. I said, right now, if you do nothing, 80% chance of having to pay a $3 million ransom. So if we do nothing, or we can go in and $300K in 6 months, or 300K in 6 months, or $800K in 3 months. And they came back to me and said, Eric, what about in a month? If we want it fixed in a month, what would it cost? And here's world-class. A world-class CISO looks and says, that's an excellent question. I haven't done the analysis on that. I will get back to you within a week with an answer. I will get back to you. Let me do the analysis and make sure that we can actually deliver on that. That's world-class. Not world-class says some random number, 1.5 million. And they have no clue whether they can or they can't, right? But they just, well, it's double what we said for 3 months, so it sounds right. No. It's better to say, you don't know and let me do the analysis, and they'll respect you for that, than to go in and make up some random numbers that you have no idea whether you can or cannot deliver against that. So you want to make sure you're always crystal clear on what you can and what you can't do. Now, so far with everything we've been talking about with ransomware, we've really been talking about the reactive, the response side of things. After you get hit with ransomware, can you back up the data? Should you pay the ransom? The options to the executive. These are all important things. Tabletop exercises, incident response. These are all very important things for a chief information security officer to be aware of. But what is ultimately the best method? Prevention. Now remember, prevention is ideal, but detection is a must, right? So I'm not saying you can always prevent it, but let's just spend some time. How do the attackers get in? What are the exposure points? And what's interesting is if you get the fundamentals of security correct, it's not that complicated. If you've heard any of my other talks, I always talk about four main vulnerabilities that threats will exploit to get into your business. And essentially, if somebody's going to break into your organization, it's got to be vulnerabilities in one of four areas: on the client, on the server, at the vendor, or the individual, like Robert Hansen, Aldrich James. And what's funny is that's the exact evolution of ransomware. So traditional, good old-fashioned ransomware comes in via email, right, to the client. The client gets infected, and then the client spreads throughout the rest of the network. So to go in and defend against that, there's a couple of options. One is to separate out the client. So the client doesn't have direct access, and when they need to access critical data, there's an authentication component that's required. The problem today is, one, we allow email with attachments and embedded links into clients. We allow more than we should. Not all the time, but most of the ransomware attacks that we've seen have come from emails with embedded links or attachments from unknown, untrusted, or new sources. So if you just go in and recognize that'll have minimal impact to your organization, and you say, okay, any new emails, new accounts, anything that's not registered from a known trusted host, we're not going to allow attachments or embedded links, that's going to go in and stop a large percent. Now, you still have VEC, vendor email compromise. This is where a trusted, known third party that you deal with on a regular basis gets compromised. Their mail system gets compromised, so you're getting emails from legitimate entities on email threads that are valid, from valid people you communicate with on a regular basis, except it's controlled by the adversary, and they're now putting an embedded attachment or link that has malicious code on it. So those are much harder because you're not going to filter those out. But to me, there's a couple of ways that you can still address that. And this is from a chief information security officer. You need to look at these different options. One is, let's just call it the way it is. When did email become a file transfer mechanism? Why are we allowing attachments and embedded links in emails? In my company, we don't. We have several different sources, from Dropbox to SharePoint, and different storage mechanisms where all attachments are put, and we have communication set up with our trusted vendors. Now, you could argue, well, Eric, if they're going to get into the email system of a vendor, they can get into communication. The little difference there is, if you get into somebody's system, typically you can send email without credentials. But if you're going to access a third-party site, you need credentials. So there are some slight differences there, and that does take away some of the vectors. So one option is allowing embedded links and attachments really a futuristic feature that our organization wants to support? That one, I'm not saying, yeah, you're right. That you as a CISO have to work with the executives on your security tolerance and threat posture on whether that is something you do or don't want to allow. Another thing that I do with our clients and with myself is I have two different devices. My Windows computer, I only use for creating documents, reports, and doing my work. I have an iPad that I carry around with me, and you can use a phone if you want to. And the only thing I do on that iPad is surf the web and check email, the two most dangerous applications on the planet. First, most of the malware we're seeing today are targeted for Windows systems, not because Windows is more vulnerable. I'm going to give credit where credit's due. I mean, Windows today is a very robust, secure system. It's just if 90% of the population use it, that's what you're going after. So it's a target of opportunity. So if I'm using a non-Windows device, potential of compromise is greatly reduced. Next, if that's all I do is check email and surf the web, if that iPad does get compromised, there's no other data, there's no information, right? It's connected to the internet, right, to access email and others. It's not directly connected to the internal network. So there's really a minimal spreading. So notice what we did. We broke a connection point where we have one system connected to the internal network where all of our data is, and another system connected to the surfing the web, and our email server, which is typically on a different segment or different location from the network. So we're now designing, architecturing our system with different devices, different breakdown. And then last thing as a CISO is now that we're supporting a remote workforce, what I recommend is a generic 3-tier architecture. All of our data is in the cloud, controlled, managed, and many of these cloud providers do have physical backup services. So if you're with a robust cloud provider and you're paying for it, they do have ransomware protection. So that one thing is helpful. Second, we have an authentication tier. You always have to authenticate, verify, and validate with 2-factor. And then you have a thin client on the endpoint. So no more hard drives, no more long-term storage. You get a new operating system every time you start up, which should be every 12 to 24 hours. So now not only probability of getting malicious code or ransomware is a lot slimmer, but even if you do, it now has to authenticate. And now if you're working and all of a sudden it's saying, please enter this password or that password, you could say, well, why? I'm already doing this, right? So there's some trigger points that are there. So the client is probably the hardest because the more functionality you allow, right, the less security. Remember, just like the law of gravity, the law of cybersecurity says whenever you're adding functionality, you're reducing security. So you have to decide that balance. Too many companies now have so much functionality and the security is low. We need to bring that into balance. So I gave you some options for dealing with that. Then the second vulnerability is on the server side. And that's what we saw with some of the more recent attacks where they went after servers. Now, in those cases, you had servers accessible from the internet that were missing patches that contained critical data. So the server one is pretty easy. If we just follow our 2 core fundamental rules, any systems accessible from the internet are always patched, always. But Eric, what if I can't patch it because an application doesn't work? No problem. That system is not worthy of being on the internet, right? It's got to be on an internal network. Any internet-facing systems must be fully patched, and any internet-facing system must never, ever, ever contain critical data. You follow those 2 rules, you're good. You want a bonus rule? Bonus rule is any critical infrastructure systems, whether it's healthcare, financial, electrical, utility, water, oil, pipeline, those are always air-gapped, right? Those systems are never directly accessible from the internet or directly accessible from business or public networks. Now, yes, in that case, an air gap increases security and decreases functionality. But if you look at the criticality of that information, that's a decision that you as a chief information security officer need to make and need to decide. And then the third one that we just saw recently is supply chain, where we saw supply chain last year that just tried to steal data. Now we're seeing supply chain with ransomware attached to it. So the idea is instead of breaking into a bunch of companies, let's find a software vendor that supports the companies we want, infect their software with malicious code, they install it at all these clients, and boom, we now have a large-scale, wholesale ransomware attack. Once again, with third party and supply chain, we have that rule. All external connections must be filtered and firewalled. I remember I was teaching security classes 20 years ago, and I said the golden rule of architecture and firewall design is any external connections must be firewalled and filtered before going into the network. And once again, same issue with the Target breach, SolarWinds, and all these others. We need to do a better job of segmenting, reducing exposure, and reducing entry points. So as a CISO, you need to look at your network architecture diagram very closely and say, how segmented are we? Are we wide open like Target was, where when a heating, ventilation, and air conditioning vendor got compromised, they could get to every point of sale system at every store? I mean, that's crazy. We need to better segment, better isolate, and better lock down our systems. So when we're talking about ransomware, it's definitely important to have the discussion with executives, understand your exposure, determine what your stance is on paying the ransom, do incident response, and make sure that you're also having proper backups. But most importantly, deal with the vulnerabilities. Limit attachments in email. Use separate devices. Use thin clients. Any systems accessible from the internet, make sure they're patched. Make sure they never contain critical data, and always segment out connections from external vendors. So as a chief information security officer, you need to put together a plan. You need to understand where your vulnerabilities and exposures are, and you need to present that to your executives. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Life of a CISO. As always, post some comments. I love to hear from you, and I'd love to hear about questions for future episodes. And if you haven't picked up your copy of Cyber Crisis, make sure you pick it up today, because whether you like it or not, we are in the midst of a cyber crisis.